livestock. And to succeed with the revolution and comply with some tricky environmental limitations and with the crisis that I mentioned before, the global agenda has created a simple but rather sophisticated formula. I quote, "The livestock sector needs to produce more using fewer resources with benefits to all." Right. Seems to be magic to me. What is meant here by producing more using fewer resources with benefits to all? The global agenda does not necessarily mean fewer animals, because somebody has to produce meat, flesh, eggs, milk, etc. Well, somebody has to do that, right? But the global agenda rather means fewer inputs, like feed, less waste, fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And this agricultural project can be summed up under the term sustainable intensification. You might have come across the term if you study current agricultural developments on a global scale. And sustainable intensification is the go-to solution nowadays, and it can include things like climate-smart agriculture, precision farming, things like that. Agroecology is sometimes also integrated under the umbrella of sustainable intensification, although that's perhaps a more complicated matter. Of course, in any case, sustainable intensification does include things like climate-smart agriculture and agriculture in general that relies on lots of chemical inputs, technology, etc., so industrial agriculture. In the case of the animal industry, intensification means, well, that's what we have heard before, right? Larger plants, more animals, less space. That's kind of straightforward. As I said, industrial systems are on the rise, and they have largely overpassed grazing systems and also mixed systems that in livestock production. And in particular, grazing systems are blamed for their extensive use of the land, for their high emissions, and for their relatively mediocre output, which means for their low efficiency compared to industrial systems. What is sustainable about sustainable intensification? Sustainability is translated in the animal industry into waste management, in creating or designing improved animals, which means, for instance, genetically modified animals with a changed digestion so that they don't emit as much methane, or animals with an improved diet, which means more efficient feed production and feed administration. And in feed administration, this is called environmental nutrition. A concrete example: environmental nutrition is nutrition that provides the animal with a minimum amount of nutrients, but with a maximum amount of growth and productivity. The rationale behind administering the animal a minimum amount of nutrients is, on the one hand, a financial incentive, or costs, but also environmental regulations. How come? So if you feed a farmed animal nutrients, the animal will always perhaps excrete parts of those nutrients, and then those nutrients end up in factory waste, in the environment, in the surrounding, etc. But the factory has a financial incentive to comply with environmental regulations, right? So it cannot have too high runoff of nutrients like nitrogen, etc. So what does this mean for the animal? It means that the animal, for example, if we imagine a pig, like here portrayed here on the slide, a pig is getting very heavy and has very rapid growth in a too short amount of time, so that in the end his or her skeleton breaks because the pig hasn't gotten enough nutrients. So the skeleton breaks while the pig is still alive. This problem again, reduces, of course, the carcass quality and is economically damaging for the factory farm. So environmental nutrition is about balancing out all of those factors, but what we can state is that animal welfare is generally not taken into account. The scholar Jonathan Clark has framed this environmental nutrition as environmental violence that is being inflicted upon the animals. Now, last bit of theory. How can we frame sustainable intensification theoretically? Because that's what sociologists and environmental sociologists like to do. From an analytical standpoint, we can assign sustainable intensification to so-called ecological modernization theory, right? So before we've heard about modernization theory, and now we have the ecological counterpart. Ecological modernization theory has been developed in the 1970s, 80s. It's kind of the neoliberal answer to the more radical environmental movement of the 1970s. And what does an ecological modernization theory say? It says that, again, we have a kind of a societal hierarchy. We have a linear evolution of all human societies, and on top, again, of a ladder is the minority world because of its advanced environmental protection. The majority world is not so ecological, perhaps they don't recycle enough. In any case, the minority world is presented as kind of the green winner, right, or the green example in societal evolution. Ecological modernization theory promotes the viable and even profitable combination of environmental protection on the one hand, here in green, and profit on the other hand. And this combination is said to be possible with voluntary regulation, so it's a neoliberal answer, right, so rolling back the states, it's all voluntary, and with new technologies. From the 1990s on, sustainable development policies often focus on green growth, green economy. I'm sure you've also heard the term green economy, greening the economy, I guess all of which can be summed up under the keyword green capitalism. What is more, if we come back to this linear development, or linear like ecological development of human societies, the minority world is actually responsible for the bulk of meat consumption, right, and also for the bulk of environmental destruction. Remember, the minority world consumes roughly 3 times more animal protein than the majority world, but still, extensive and subsistent agriculture of the poor in the majority world are blamed for environmental degradation and inefficient land use. So the changes proposed in sustainable intensification in the form of intensification or land management should mainly take place in the majority world, following the official Livestock Revolution discourse. Perhaps you remember that the Livestock Revolution promised to be, I quote, a rare opportunity for smallholder farmers to benefit from a rapidly growing market. Well, in reality, the benefits for those so-called rural poor are more than doubtful. The livestock operations that dominate the Livestock Revolution are industrial systems and not extensive systems because they're not deemed efficient enough. And the market is really ruled by highly engineered meat packing companies. Further, given the inefficiency of animal production, food security is rather being eroded than guaranteed. Here we see a bar chart by the FAO, and for those bars they've used the numbers of the original Livestock Revolution report from 1999. So the numbers for 2020 are projections, but if we compare them to the actual statistics on grain use, the projections have been like true or accurate 20 years ago. So the bar chart is on cereal use as feed in 1992-94 and contrasting it with 2020. If we look at it, we can observe that cereal use as feed has significantly increased in so-called developing countries. Here, the second bar, and also China. Much more so than in so-called developed countries, right? In so-called minority world. So the light red is 1992, right? And the dark red is the projection for 2020. And I think in countries where people suffer from malnutrition, such as in the majority world, of course this also happens in the minority world, but much more so in the majority world. So in those countries, the use of cereal as feed can be described as problematic. If we go back to the environmental crisis, the revolution seems equally tricky or delicate to achieve. The projected livestock revolution alone, and by alone I mean without any other sector like energy or transport, so the livestock revolution alone should cause a global warming of around 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. And the 2 degrees Celsius are the figure that the IPCC projects, but for the year 2100, right? But just with the Livestock Revolution, we would already reach a global warming of 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. So 50 years before the official projections of 2100. So I guess climate change will be a problem, global warming. And then it's also not clear where the necessary resources for the Livestock Revolution should be taken from, the water, the land, etc. To mitigate the already gigantic environmental impact of the industry nowadays, it would be crucial to actually reduce the excessive consumption of animal products in the minority world. Because how can we expect people in the so-called majority world to curb their meat consumption and their exploitation of the environment if we ourselves are at the forefront of the industrial slaughter of animals, of contributing to climate change, of turning nature into natural capital, etc. In fact, a vegan diet, and you have lots of studies on that matter, a vegan diet would produce on average half of greenhouse gas emissions than an omnivore diet, and it would also use around half of the land. But the Livestock Revolution still goes unquestioned in the mainstream international discourse. Interestingly, at the World Climate Summit in Paris, that we mentioned briefly in the beginning, if we thought about social movements, at this World Climate Summit in Paris in 2015, the animal industry was not addressed at all. Of course, the dimension of the abused farmed animals in the industry is also a topic that is almost completely left out. If the supposedly growing demand for animal protein should be met by 2050, perhaps by magic, the number of slaughtered animals would rise to 120 billion, and most of those individuals will be chickens. Okay, this was a lot of information. We're now at the end of my presentation, and I would like to close with a quote by Schneider, by the sociologist Schneider, that some of you might know. So Schneider says that there is a difference between food on the one hand and industrial meat on the other hand, because industrial meat equals corporate livestock and as such capital accumulation, right? So capital, head of cattle is just money and not food. And I think we can apply this quote to the topic of the Livestock Revolution in general. So I quote, "Industrial meat represents the diversion of calories, soil nutrients, water, fossil fuels, research funds and focus and labor away from possibilities for producing food and livelihoods for people in an equitable and sustainable way, and towards feeding corporate livestock, which in turn feeds capital accumulation. In both a material sense, related to the physical use of land and resources to produce feed and industrial meat rather than food, and an ideological sense related to modernist notions of dietary transitions that include increased meat consumption, meat is a category that elides easy classification as simply the food of food security. The space created between nutrient and energy losses when grains and oilseeds are converted into meat is a political space." End quote. And for me, this political space is the crux of the matter. The Livestock Revolution is a problem of truly planetary scale. It is portrayed as a natural evolution. However, I think we have seen that it's not as natural as it seems in the first sight. Our diet is being meatified, and this meatification is not only a reflection of global injustice, it actually exacerbates this injustice. But as the discourse of the Livestock Revolution is coupled with poverty eradication and food security, it even seems like this meatification is an act of philanthropy. On the other hand, I think we have seen that it could also be described as a process of cultural and economic imperialism. Finally, the exploitation of even more non-human animals is portrayed as something natural and necessary to feed the poor, and is therefore legitimized. But the wider public actually knows only little about the politics and political economy of meat production. That's why I deem it crucial to shed light on all those factors and to show that the primary aim of the animal industry and specifically of the livestock revolution is not to produce food but to make money. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm looking forward to your questions and to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Livia, for such an interesting presentation. We have one question from an online viewer, but before open Q&A session to online viewers, I have a question. Do you think that a change, in order to change, that we necessarily would have to have some kind of another like meat revolution, like a poultry revolution, or a change? Could be a smooth change, could be conducted, I don't know, it wouldn't necessarily have to go through poultry revolution or pork revolution. I don't know if I was clear in my question.
I don't know if I really got it. So you mean if there is an alternative to the poultry or pork revolution? Or
how this, the livestock revolution, how
right.
What are the alternatives? So if necessarily you would have to go through like a kind of like poultry revolution or a pork revolution.
I mean, actually, the livestock revolution will be kind of poultry and pork revolution, right? Because those will be the main species that will be exploited. Cattle not so much, or much relatively less. But if you're asking me about the future of food production, it could be a cereal revolution. I mean, if we say that human population is expected to reach around, I think, 10 billion people by 2020, by 2050, so in the next decades, right, we will for sure reach 10 billion people. It would be much more like ecological, much more efficient, much more healthy also in some regards to just eat more plant-based food. And this could be done, in a much more efficient way. So the livestock revolution can be one trajectory, but I hope that I have shown more or less that it's actually a very destructive and violent trajectory, and not only to the animals themselves, also to the environment and also to social relations. But I think the problem is we keep talking about the livestock revolution, and in lots of international reports, the first sentences are often meat consumption will almost double by 2050, population will grow, etc., etc. And this is just taken for granted, right? And it's all based on this one discussion paper. And normally you have no diverging voice, right? Even big animal protection organizations join this discourse or have joined the global agenda for sustainable livestock that also promotes the livestock revolution in a so-called sustainable way. But they're all feeding into this official discourse. And if we don't challenge this discourse, we can't exit it, right? We're kind of in this lock-in, ideological lock-in, and then also lock-in in terms of production. We don't even imagine that there could be an alternative. Although it's a very specific, particular evolution in food production. That's not something that somebody is born would think, oh yeah, right, I have to consume 100 kilos of meat a year. Yeah, I hope I was able to answer your question as for alternatives in food production.
Are there there's so many different aspects that are tied to animal, to the livestock industry.
Right.
And there's water issues, there's agricultural policies, there's also kind of the right to food, sort of the lack of sort of the implementation of that.
Right.
How, are there any, maybe we went over it in class today, but I'm not sure, but is there a sort of
you could just address all of these and kind of come up with regulations for all these different aspects.
What do you mean by forum? Do you mean kind of a social movement forum, or on a kind of a top-down approach? Well, a legal forum, an international institutions forum, civil society forum?
Yeah, I don't really know. I suppose more of like how to best sort of. I mean, there's also, of course, you have to make changes socially, but there's also like the regulation aspects of it.
Sure.
To kind of limit the power of corporations.
Of course.
I guess what would be the best angle or the most effective angle through which to start regulating corporations and to kind of address all these other issues that come with it?
Yeah. This is a huge question, right? I mean, how can we solve this problem, right? It's kind of the question, how do we do it? How do we change the world, right? And who controls the corporations? So who actually has the power to control and the corporations to regulate animal production and also to enforce the regulations? We have seen, and we talked about it today, that the GDP of different nations is much lower than the benefits, or how should I say, the proceedings of corporations, right? So nowadays they're really powerful. It's also, of course, a consequence of neoliberalism that has diminished the power of nation states. So I actually don't even know where to start answering this question. If you ask me what is the most efficient way to challenge the livestock revolution, I would say society is not a jukebox, and I think there's not something, you can't just enter a coin and then you will have such and such XYZ result. It's difficult to project in which direction a society moves or how societal change comes about. And for my limited experience, I would say that we need kind of all tools from the toolbox, in the sense of that it's great when people engage in legislation if they feel that's their vocation and their talent. As right now, I see that's quite difficult, because you have so much economic interest in keeping the regulations, if there are regulations in the first place, right? Because farmed animals, it's not a lot of regulations that protect them, or if they protect them, they protect them in a minimal amount. So those minimal or cosmetic animal welfare policies are often also just used to increase profits, because then you can use the nice animal welfare label and you can sell your products even for a higher price, which is also actually it's kind of a new topic that has emerged in the global agenda for sustainable livestock, which unites, as I said, governments, lobbies, NGOs, social movements, and animal protection agencies. So they actually advocate animal welfare, and they advocated saying it's more sustainable and it's more economic, in the sense of you can make more money with it, right? So the problem is such an interconnected issue. There's huge interest behind, because the lobby for animal production is just so big that it has actually influenced different states to change their legislation to criminalize animal protection or animal liberation initiatives, to criminalize people who go film factory farms, so-called AGAG laws in the US, for instance, or to criminalize people who go and free animals, to label them as terrorists, etc. So unfortunately, I don't really see the law on our side, or on the side of food justice or social justice or animal or environmental liberation initiatives. That's kind of a sobering conclusion. But as I said, I think the struggle is here, and I think we should fight the livestock revolution on every level that we're capable of, be it at a dinner table, talking about it, questioning, is it actually normal to consume such a high amount of animal protein? Has it always been like that? What does it mean for the animals that have to suffer and die for our palate? What does it mean for the environment? What does it mean for the workers in the complex? Yeah, you can, in my opinion, you should also start on every level. That also kind of applies to you, right? Or where you see your competences to organize as a civil society or as concerned people. Yeah.
Mine will be very short. I just would like to know, where do you see the scope? Where do you think the advocates can really start from, or can it end up where it can start from, and then where it can end up? Of course, where it will end up in changing of animal, granting animal the right to be considered, but we still have a problem there at national level. Do you think the scope, the way of advocacy can start at national level, at corporate level, at international level, as a way forward to advocate for change in animal law?
Didn't you say that your question was short? I guess I could again talk for hours trying to answer that question. You were asking me in the beginning of your question, you raised the issue of animal rights, or how can we make a change, how can we move forward? And again, to situate myself, as I've grown up in Switzerland, I still live in Switzerland, I like to kind of start where I'm coming from, right? To also not decide for other people or for other cultures how they should produce their food or how should they consume food, etc. But I mean, for instance, in Switzerland, which is a paradigmatic example of corporate consolidation, of livestock intensification, although Switzerland is often painted like the picture is so-called like a Heidi country where all the animals are happy and roam freely in the Alps, etc., which is not the case at all. Just take a train to Switzerland and see how it looks like. In Switzerland, around 50 to 60 million animals are killed yearly for food production. So 50 or 60 million animals, and so if you walk around in Switzerland, I don't see those millions of animals, right, that roam freely and are happy. So, starting from that, me personally, I advocate for like the liberation of non-human animals as well as human animals, for liberation of everybody from structures of oppression. And so I would not advocate to exploit non-human animals as food in the first place. And if we take, for instance, Switzerland, the Swiss population, for instance, people living in Switzerland could survive and thrive easily on plant-based nutrition, on vegan nutrition, for instance. And I guess this applies for a lot of countries in Europe, for instance, etc. Yeah, this would be one answer for kind of a local case.
We have time for one more question. It has been partly answered, but I think it's an interesting question. It seems to me that the vegetable-based alternative to animal proteins, tofu, seitan, frozen veggie burgers, etc., and green diets are increasingly integrated in the corporate food system and do not really represent an emancipatory or liberatory alternative from the social-economic point of view. Mm-hmm. Can we have a livestock counter-revolution, just shifting to non-animal based diets, or it requires more? And what may be the role of law?
Again, a big question with different sub-questions. So I totally agree with the first observation that plant-based alternatives to meat, to sausages, to so-called chicken nuggets, etc., that they often feed in a kind of a green capitalism frame or regime, right? From an environmental perspective, still those alternatives have a much lower ecological footprint. So they are truly like better environmental alternatives. from a political perspective, often those corporations are still like part of our like capitalist corporate food regime. I know for sure some of the smaller enterprises are like collectives, they're non-hierarchically organized, so they try to live kind of a utopia in their form of production. So right now I would exclude those few perhaps very alternative social collectives that try to produce food in a different manner. So yeah, lots of those enterprises feed into kind of a green capitalist mindset, and I think what is also problematic, you have a lot of meat corporations or dairy corporations who kind of observe that this vegan thing is a big new market, so the meat corporations themselves, they produce plant-based alternatives, right? So they just diversify their production, which is a problem. And then to come back to, well, just such plant-based, like processed food, those alternatives, often they're also quite expensive, perhaps not as expensive as animal products, although as those animal products are heavily subsidized. Sometimes tofu or like vegan chicken nuggets are also very expensive. And being a vegan myself for over a decade already, I think there are lots of alternatives to those processed foods. I think you can lead quite healthy or very healthy life just relying on, for instance, beans or other sources of protein or vegetables that are not that expensive, right? So it is for sure a class question, but if you deconstruct the image of a so-called like vegan privilege or like a very expensive vegan nutrition, you also find, well, there are some structural reasons why vegetables or fruit is expensive compared to animal products, right? The subsidies, the exemptions from environmental relations, and so on, what I mentioned before. And that this image of so-called vegan privilege is also upheld by meat corporations to show, that's something artificial, that's something expensive, that's something for a white elite, which is not necessarily the correct case. So the question of plant-based alternatives, it's a tricky one. It's something that has to be studied more and that has to be addressed for sure. And then the question was, how is this linked to society in general, and what is the role of law?